All right. So now we want to talk about post-employment benefits over next 60 minutes. We will talk in detail as to how the post-employment benefits, what all it includes. As I said, this is around your retireals, right? As to once you leave the organization, post-employment means once you leave the organization, what all you are entitled for, and then how do you do accounting and reporting for that kind of arrangement from that perspective, and that is what we will aim to talk about, right? From that perspective. So what all it includes, right? From a post-employment benefits. So it includes retirement benefits such as pension and lump sum payments made on retirement. So pension, right? And normally we see pension in government companies, right, or public sector companies. Very few I've seen in my experience on the private sector that the companies do provide pensions, but again, common in government here. And then other post-employment benefit plans such as post-employment life insurance and post-employment medical care, right? So again, that also we do see post-employment life insurance and medical care. And here the payment on retirement, largely here we meant by say gratuity and your PF, right? That's what normally we see, and in some cases, of course, leave encashment as well, right? All kind of stuff. So all of that is what we see from a classification perspective. The post-employment benefit plans are of two types, which is what I talked to you at the beginning. They are like called contribution plans or benefit plans, right? Defined contribution plans and or defined benefit plans, right? And what's the distinction between defined contribution plan and a defined benefit plan, which is what I tried to explain before as well. The defined contribution plan is that where you know how much money I need to contribute, right? That is it. So you know with certainty that let's say 12% of your basic salary is what needs to go as PF contribution. Beyond that, I am under no obligation to give you anything more than that, right? That is what is called defined contribution plan, right? Now a defined benefit plan where the benefit which will accrue to an individual employee is actually linked to a formula like a gratuity. So you are in a way eligible for specified payment when the time of retirement, which is linked to the number of year of completed service and with your last drawn salary, etc., etc. So the distinction between a defined contribution and benefit, we'll talk at more length, but I think at a very high level in defined contribution, I know my liability on the date of contribution. On defined benefit, I will actually be able to only know on the date of payment or the date of settlement. In a way, till the time it is actually an estimate. So that's where the distinction is between defined contribution and benefit. And it's important for you to understand this difference, because there is a huge difference in accounting between the two, right? For all defined benefit plans, we need to involve actuarial services and get an actuary to do the valuation. As I said, it requires statistical modeling to be used, which is called projected unit credit method. That's the model which is being deployed by actuaries to determine the valuations or determine your liability, assets, and so on and so forth. From that perspective. So talking about defined contribution plan, right, and what all it covers, right? It covers the what is mean is that the entity legal or constructive obligation is limited to the amount that it agrees to contribute to the fund. So you know that how much I need to pay with a degree of finality, right? And that's what is defined contribution plan, right? I know that how much I need to contribute, and the amount which is received by the employee is determined by the amount of contribution paid by an entity, right? And perhaps in PF, right, both the employer and the employee do pay. So but I'm more responsible for my side of the bargain, which is what the employer has to pay, and whatever employee pays anyway, that's part of my salary, right? That's not part of my PF contribution. As a result of this, the actuarial risk, and that's the important thing, the actuarial risk and the investment risk, right? So actuarial risk is what? Actuarial risks are risk which I take in estimates and assumptions, right? Mortality, right? So for example, if the retirement age is 60, right? Whether you will be able to continue employment till 60 or you may not be able to, right? Attrition risk, right? Whether whether you may decide to leave the organization sooner than what otherwise your contractual terms suggest, right? So there are several of the interest rate risk, for example, right? As to what do I believe is the interest rate, because when you're trying to figure out that how much I need to pay, you need to pay in the future, but you need to record the liability today. So the future payout has to be discounted to the present, and that discounting is linked to the interest rate environment, right? So your interest rate risk, your mortality risk, your attrition risk, the number of those assumptions which goes into in a way valuation of your retiral obligations, and that is what is being called as actuarial risk. And similarly, you have the investment risk. So if you're creating a corpus in relation to a post-retiral fund, which I need to then take out the money from that fund and pay it to an employee, right? So that again creates an investment risk on the entity which is managing the investment. So all of that in a defined contribution plan actually is supposed to be rest with the employee or with an external third party, right? Let's say maybe Government of India in a PF contribution, that risk in a way has been taken over by the Government of India, right? Especially if the company is actually contributing with the PF authorities and they have not created their own trust in a way where they contribute the money or contribute the PF for an employee. So essential part is that defined contribution plan is such where you know how much I need to contribute, and that is it, right? And there is no risk beyond which you carry from a financial statement perspective. So that if there are any other risk, which is actuarial risk or an investment risk, that risk in a way has been transferred to the employee or with another third party, right? From that perspective, that is what is called a defined contribution plan. And there could be some exceptions always, right? A plan benefit formula that is not linked solely to the amount of contribution and require the entity to provide further contribution if assets are insufficient to meet the benefits in the plan benefit formula, or a guarantee either directly through a plan or indirectly specified return on contribution. Now, if that been the case, in a way, then it is no longer a defined contribution plan, which is what happens in a PF scenario. That if you're maintaining a provident fund trust, let's say I'm a company ABC, right? Now this company ABC Limited, instead of transferring the PF contribution of employees to the Government of India kitty, and then the employee will claim their money from the Government of India, they decide to set up their own PF trust, right? And then they transfer the money to the PF trust. But the law of the land suggests that if there is a shortfall on the payment on the PF trust, then the company will have to, ABC will have to make good that shortfall. That in a case that you are actually in a way responsible to generate returns on that investment and then pay out those investment returns to the employee. And if there is a shortfall, because let's say government decides to give return of 8%, and where you only able to generate a return of 7%, right? Or there is a bad debt on your decision, right? So what happened, let's say in recent time, ILFS used to maintain a lot of these funds, right? And there was a default because of their bankruptcy. So that has resulted in huge losses into a lot of these private trust being managed by a lot of companies. So that means there's an investment risk, right? So how do you deal with that? Okay, in a way then that it takes the color of defined contribution, right? So informal practices that give rise to a constructive obligation. So all of that is one needs to be very, very careful, and then it may not be a defined contribution. But otherwise, if you know what I need to contribute and that is it, then it's a defined contribution plan. Now, what's a defined benefit plan? As I said, in a defined contribution, that the actuarial risk and the investment risk shifts from the employer to the employee or to a third party. Now, here the actuarial risk or the investment risk is with the employer. Now, in that case, that is what is the defined benefit plan. The entity obligation is to provide the agreed benefits to the current and former employee, and actuarial risk and investment risk fall in substance on the entity. So those risks are now sitting with the entity. In that, if that been the case, if the actuarial or investment experience are worse than expected, the entity obligation may be increased for providing to the employees, right? So that way your P&L or balance sheet is exposed to the volatility, because of market forces as well. And you may not know the actual risk which you are carrying, right? Because it is linked to the market forces. It is linked to the market. So if I were to simply do a quick comparison between a defined benefit plan and a contribution plan, entity obligation in a defined contribution plan, you contribute a limited amount. Entity obligation is to provide the agreed benefit, right? Which is generally, let's say, a formula link. Okay. Whereas in terms of the risk, right? Who carries the risk? Actuarial risk and investment risk is on the employee. Here, the actuarial risk and the investment risk is on the entity. A change in the obligation, generally no change in the contribution of an entity is made except in certain cases. Here your obligation may be increased. Determination of the amount of post employment benefit is determined, it can be determined easily. Here agreed are received by the employee. So the amount is determined by the amount of contribution. Predetermined agreed post employment benefits are received by the employee. In a way, these are determined by actuarial valuation. Determined by actuarial valuation. Now, there could be a scenario of a multi-employer plan as well. Okay. So I'll classify a multi-employer plan as a defined contribution plan or a defined benefit plan under the terms of the plan. So what all happens here, right? Amount of contribution is decided, keeping in mind the amount of benefit that an entity is required to pay in the same period. And then future benefits that an entity gets during the current period will be paid out of future contribution. And employee benefits are determined by the length of their service in the entity as a future amount which is required to be paid to them. And employers have no realistic means of withdrawing from the plan without paying a contribution for the benefits earned. In a way, a lot of companies are coming together, pooling, and then and kind of contribution, and then they can in a way withdraw as and when there is a payment which is required to be made, right, to an employee. So from a recognition perspective, right, in case the multi-employer plan is a defined benefit plan, then again, as an entity needs to record for its proportionate share of defined benefit obligation, the plan asset or plan assets, and its cost associated. So a lot of these plans, which are managed by LIC in India, right? They in a way try and manage the multi-employer plan from that perspective. A lot of they write on the gratuity risk and so on and so forth. So that is where, as a company, I need to figure out what's my obligation, what's my share of plan assets, and what's the cost associated with the plan. And again, I need to disclose the information, right? Disclose. From a recognition of a defined contribution plan, how does it gets recorded from a balance sheet, from a P&L perspective, right? If the sufficient information is not available, entity will account for it as if it were a defined contribution plan, right? So whatever you keep on funding and disclose, and the fact that the plan is a defined benefit plan and reason. So if you're operating in a multi-employer plan, but you don't have enough information to get to everything, you treat them as a defined contribution plan, which is the same thing, right? You got to do accounting based on the reliability of the information, your ability to make a reliable estimate. So if you're not able to make a reliable estimate, right, then you have to deal with the same problem in an alternative way, or the best possible solution at a particular point in time. So here, then whatever money you are putting in, that becomes like a defined contribution, and disclose that there could be some more risk which you may have, of which you are not able to make appropriate determination at this point in time, right? The expected contribution, and if there is a surplus or deficit, right? If there is a surplus or deficit in the plan, it may affect the amount of future contribution. And then there are some more disclosures which needs to be made in that situation, right? Implications, if any, for the entity. So let's try and deal with this with the help of an example here. Gamma Limited has accounted its defined benefit plan as a defined contribution plan, as sufficient information is not available with the company. As per the agreement between Gamma Limited and other participants of the plan, okay, the deficit is to be shared between them, okay. Awesome. So Gamma Limited is accounted for its defined benefit as a defined contribution, and other participants of the plan, the deficit is shared between them. As on 31st of December 2019, there is a deficit of INR 70 crore in the plan as per the valuation. All the participants in the plan have agreed to make contribution over a 10-year period to eliminate the deficit of 70 crores. Gamma Limited will have to contribute INR 5 crores. Out of 70 crore, I have to contribute 5 crores. So what is the implication of the above agreement on the books of Gamma Limited, right? So how do I account for this? It's a defined benefit because I have the investment risk or the actuarial risk which is sitting, but I don't have enough information. So what I do, it's a defined contribution. Entity shall recognize a liability and a corresponding expense for a contribution payable to the plan. Further, when contributions are not expected to settle, they should be discounted. Accordingly, recognize a liability and a corresponding expense for the amount equal to the contribution of 5 crores, right? So equal to the 5 crore is what I need to do, discounted for time value of money. So let's say if 8% is a discounting factor, I need to discount it by 8%, 5 crore, and record the present value of that as an immediate expense. Because a deficit for the past, it's not a deficit for the future, right? So I need to record an immediate charge and then accrete this amount with the interest cost over next 10 years in a way from that perspective. Okay. Let's talk about state plans, right? What are these? Are accounted for in same way as a multi-employer plan, right? They're normally established by legislation to cover all entities, right? And are operated by national or local government, like we have the PF Trust here, right? Or another body which are not subject to influence by the reporting entity. Many state plans are funded on a pay-as-you-go basis. In such kind of a case, future benefits earned during the current period will be paid out of future contribution. An entity has no legal and constructive obligation to pay those future benefits. So essentially, a lot of these, in a way, then become a defined contribution plan, right? Most of these state plans are nothing but defined contribution plan from that perspective. So there could be a defined benefit plan that share risks between various entities under common control. That's another scenario, okay? Uh, Such plans are not multiple. So I think what we're trying to do here, we're just trying to look at different types of arrangements which you may come across in a corporate setup, right? A multi-employer plan or a state plan, or where you are sharing risk between different entities and the common. Let's say there's a group, large group of companies, which are held under, which is held by one common shareholder, and that's where you try and optimize your cost, you try and pull in resources, so on and so forth, right? If there is a something which is entity under common control, then they are not a multi-employer plan, right? They are recognized as under in separate or individual financial statement, and it depends upon your obligation. So if you are taking again on the investment risk, actuarial risk, in a way it becomes the defined benefit plan. Otherwise, it's a defined contribution plan from that perspective. So if it is a net defined benefit, so charge if there is a contractual agreement or stated policy for charging the net defined benefit cost for the whole plan to individual group entities. If no such agreement or policy, defined benefit cost shall be recognized in the separate or individual financial statement of the group entity that is legally the sponsoring employer for the plan. And they also need to, other entities also need to record this as a cost equal to their contribution payable for the period. Okay, and then basically we don't see this honestly commonly. This is not something which we see on a common basis. But again, the principles exist, the possibilities exist, in a way from that perspective. The kind of participation in such a plan is a related party transaction for each individual group entity. So again, you got to look at the disclosures very, very carefully. So the contractual agreement or the stated policy, how you want to share the cost, that needs to be disclosed. The policy for determining the contribution to be paid by the entity, that needs to be disclosed. Now, if the entity accounts for an allocation of the net defined benefit cost, then disclosure has to be made for information about the whole plan. If the entity accounts for the contribution payable for the period, the information about that plan also needs to be disclosed. Again, what I'm just trying to say here is that a whole host of disclosures, and again, uh, conceptually what you need to remember is that, is this a defined benefit plan or a contribution plan, right? And when you get to a defined benefit or a contribution, the distinction is actually to say, in a contribution plan, I know how much I need to pay, end of the story, right? On the date of contribution, my liability ends, right? Whereas in a defined benefit plan, I don't know how much I will end up paying, right? So in a way, I take on the actuarial risk and the investment risk on myself. If I have done so, that's a defined benefit plan. Otherwise, it's a defined contribution plan. Okay. Now, the accounting for a defined benefit plan is a lot more complex than a defined contribution plan. All right. And in a and then there could be several other scenarios like what we talked about. There could be a state sponsored plan, like a state plan or central plan, as we see in our scheme of things. Like PF trust is a central PF authority we have, and we contribute money and then they pay us. So the employer has shifted the risk to the government, and that is like a defined contribution plan from an employer perspective, right? And similarly, there could be a multi-employer plan. Multiple people are in a way coming together and then form a benefit plan for the employee. And depending upon the who's going to bear the risk and rewards, it can be a contribution plan or it can be a benefit plan. Now, if there is a benefit plan but you don't have enough information to make accounting as a benefit plan, then you account for that as a contribution plan and do all the relevant, in a way, disclosures. And if there are plans which are under common control, right, you got to be very, very careful in terms of related disclosures, all related parties. All of that is what we need to look at and be careful about. So quickly, in a way, and we're going to talk a lot more about how do all these accounting and reporting needs to be looked at from a defined benefit and contribution. So we talked about defined contribution, we talked about defined benefit, we talked about state plans, we talked about multi-employer plans, and we also talked about multi-employer plans which are under common control. So all of that is what we talk to you at length in terms of helping you understand the distinction, the characteristics of each of them, and how do you in a way deal with them from a defined contribution and benefit, from that perspective. Now we're going to talk to you about the accounting for defined contribution plans, right? Let's talk about accounting for defined contribution plans. All right, I'm just going to take a pause.